Hello, this is a Brighter Futures film about how research can improve policy and change lives. It's my pleasure to welcome Friederike Mengel from the Department of Economics here at the University of Essex. Specialism and expertise in behavioural economics, in family and health, in social networks. So a range of things that we can be picking up in our conversation. So welcome, Friederike. So would you like to start by telling us a little bit about the kind of economic methods that you use to understand social change, behavioural change, and why that's important?
Yes, absolutely. So I use a variety of methods in my research. I use theoretical modeling, trying to get, the fundamental principles by which things happening by, proposing a theoretical model. And then I use data to test these models. And I use a variety of data sources. I conduct a lot of lab experiments here at the University of Essex. We have a very nice lab. So I do that. I do online experiments, survey studies. I use administrative data. And if I can, I collaborate with companies or other institutions, to get data from their workforce or other, important data to study, depending on the research question we want to study.
Yes, and so take us into kind of one of those areas that you've been working on recently about taking that data and putting it in a context that has practical and policy implications, presumably, as well.
Yeah. So recently we have obviously all been going through the COVID pandemic and lockdowns in various countries, almost all countries of the world. And that has brought a lot of transitions. And one of the biggest transitions was that people started to work from home. And that has a lot of implications, not just for, how work is done, but also for sort of city centers, infrastructure, transport, the environment, there's a whole, a host of implications. And we conducted one study with an Indian IT company, and they gave us data on 10,000 of their employees, which is a big sample size. And we observed in detail their work patterns, how many hours they worked, how many meetings they sat in, which type of meetings, how many emails they wrote, how many Zoom calls they were on, all this type of things. And we observe as well their performance, their output measures, what did they produce. And we observed that both before the lockdown started in India, so when they went to the office and had their sort of normal working from office patterns, as well as afterwards, for a total period of probably just above a year, like 14 months. And one thing we saw is, using this data, is that productivity in the home office was substantially lower than in the actual office. And we are trying to understand why that is the case.
So that could be a surprise because there are very different views on this. And obviously we need exactly that kind of data, don't we, to start to inform the sorts of changes that people might prefer. So tell us a little bit about why that was the case and what kind of conclusions do you draw from it?
So one interesting thing when you ask people in surveys about productivity in the home office, if you ask employees, do you think you were more productive at home or more productive in the office? People tend to say, there's a bit of heterogeneity across countries, across types of professions, but people tend to say, I was actually more productive at home. It was a good thing. Whereas if you ask employers, it's the other way around. They say, no, my workforce was less productive at home. And it's kind of interesting why that is different perceptions. And one thing we conjecture is that people felt, I'm getting the same amount of stuff done at home as I used to get done, and maybe I'm even feeling a bit more relaxed or happy at home.
Didn't have to travel and so
Didn't have to travel, exactly, saved that amount of time. And that's actually also what we see in these data. People do get about the same amount done. It decreases a little bit, their output, but not by a lot. But what we see is the time they put in increases massively, and that's what drives the decrease in productivity. So they spend a lot more time getting the same amount of stuff done. And that is not because they take breaks or have coffees in between. So we observe the actual time using software the company has installed on their employees' laptops, home office laptops. We observe exactly what they're doing, if they're moving the mouse, what tool they're in. Are they on Facebook, sort of, chatting with their friends, or are they, on the coding tool actually, working? And we observe that this networking time increases substantially. Including in after hours, like, late at night. And
so that's very interesting. There's lots of what could be almost kind of counterintuitive, some of those things, but it's just because we have different perspectives on what is work and what is productivity. And maybe people feel happier just working longer hours at home, even though that actually translates into not a lot of difference with productivity.
Exactly. So ex ante, of course, a productivity decrease is something economists do not like, right?
Right.
Because the time that that people spend producing, the additional time they spend, they could have used it in other productive ways, right? Which would be good for the economy. But of course, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. It could be that people are actually happier, working at a slower pace, or at a and if that's the case, then even economists would agree that it's not a bad thing, right? If people are happier but less productive, that's fine. But what the data suggests to us that it's not the whole story. It's not just a choice of people that that they choose to work at a slower rate. But one of the key contributing factors we found is that people do not have enough uninterrupted work time, so they get interrupted all the time by meetings. So there's more meetings, more emails, more Zoom calls, and that suggests to us that there are substantial coordination costs. Like, people are sitting in very different locations now. They have a small problem, maybe in their coding. Normally they would just ask their desk neighbor. Now they have to go on a Zoom call, right? So you don't immediately go on the call. Maybe you try another half hour before you bother your colleague. Once you get on the Zoom call, you don't straight away jump in and say, I have this problem. You ask, how are you doing? How are things? And all these additional coordination costs.
So there's a kind of negotiation that needs to go on, that is a different form to being in the same place where you're working before.
Right.
Do you think that this sort of research has implications for when people are thinking about, for example, a 4-day week? There are experiments from across Europe. Quite a number of businesses within the UK are now trying this. There's some countries, Finland, for example, is talking about making this standard. But there's a general issue about rethinking patterns of work.
That's right.
Which wasn't just to do with COVID, but COVID gave us a big kind of boost.
Experiment kind of.
Exactly, and made experimental space as well.
Yeah.
What sorts of thoughts do you have when you're thinking about the kind of economics of this and the behavioural changes that go around that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are lots of implications. No, it's not just the productivity, the happiness of the employees. I mean, how, maybe it's also a short run and medium run thing. Maybe in the short run it's fine to work late at night, but in the long run it will affect, it will increase stress levels. And so, there are all these issues. Maybe, the amount of social contact. People are very heterogeneous, right? Some people thrive on social contact. Some people actually prefer to be in a quiet space. And so there are all these issues. There are issues for the environment, right? If you commute less, that's kind of, potentially a good thing,
That's
right?
a good already, yes.
Exactly, So there are all these things that have to be weighed, and balanced against each other, obviously at the sort of macro societal level. For individual companies, I think it's also, useful to find sort of smart solutions. Because if employers tell us, in surveys, oh, I'm kind of happy working at home, I feel I'm productive, I mean, that's valuable information, even if the data from this particular profession, may also be different in different professions, tell us that they're actually less productive, substantially less productive. And so that's important information. So they need to find tailored solutions, I think, companies. And we have seen some companies, for example, it was in the news a few days ago that a big US company, they decided to forbid meetings on Wednesdays. So all Wednesdays are completely meeting free. And one of the motivations was that they saw similar patterns as what we saw in their data for their employees.
So that gives that kind of longer period of time to allow...
Uninterrupted time to get stuff done.
To get deeper into things. That's very interesting. Yeah. Differences for women and men? Does this open opportunities that might not have been there? This, as it were, the bigger question of rethinking working patterns.
Yes.
Trying to make them work for individuals and for individual businesses. But presumably there's also a strong gender aspect to this as well in terms of opportunity.
That's right. So we found, and I mean, in general, this literature finds that women are more negatively affected by working from home, both in terms of their productivity as well as in terms of their subjective experience. So there's different papers, also some other research coming out of Essex about mental health in the Home Office. So women are more affected. In our particular context, which was a company in India, we conjecture that it is largely due to people living with extended family, and then there are more demands in the house on women than on men, and women get interrupted potentially by extended family. Can you do this for me or that, or can you take care of
expectations on them?
Exactly, or even they're not even asked, but they feel they need to conform to certain expectations. Whereas in the West, there are some studies from the US, and and I think a study from France as well, it suggests that yes, women suffer more in the home office or are less productive, but it's more because of children at home during the pandemic. So obviously there were additional factors in the pandemic, like schools being closed, which meant that children are at home, which if you go to a home office regime outside of a pandemic, you wouldn't have that factor. Children would be in school like normal.
Yes.
But
well, take us into then the world of game theory, evolutionary game theory, as one of the aspects of your work about the study of behavior and social networks and the emergence of those. We've talked about kind of individuals in their workspace, but then they themselves are linked up in work, but also in their own communities and family networks and so forth.
Right.
Tell us a bit about how the economics of that, how you've been able to kind of tease apart some of the interesting questions.
Yes. So one of the big areas I work in is on social networks, as you say. People communicating, with others, with their friends, their colleagues, their family. Who in turn communicate with others, and we can then model this as a social network. So when I say social network, I do not mean Facebook or Twitter necessarily.
No, the term has been captured by that film.
Exactly, exactly. But I mean, sort of a network of people. Me being linked, to you being linked to somebody I don't even know, right? But any information I tell you, you might pass on to that person, right? So there's sort of indirect communication in a network, even if I, never directly talk or I don't even know these people that you might be talking to. And so we have explored we've done several empirical studies on social networks where we, study a whole variety of things. So we ask questions like, to which extent do people understand, that information that they receive in a social network is correlated? So I might talk to you and you might tell me, some opinion of yours, I think, this policy is really bad or really harmful for us. No? Then somebody else I meet later for coffee might tell me the same thing, right? So I might take this as two people have already told me that this is a bad thing, right? But what I might not realize is that you and that person might have talked to each other. Exactly. And so that is the question, to which extent do people account for this? And obviously, if they don't account for this, it's easier that we get sort of opinion bubbles, right? Because the people I talk to is not a randomly selected subset of the population, right? But they are similar to me in certain ways. And so that's already a reason why we can get opinion bubbles. But then if on top of that, people do not realize that there is this correlation, then this problem can be even more severe. We're also looking at questions of social influence, to which extent am I able, to influence others' behavior, both directly and again indirectly. I might influence you, and then you might influence some of your friends. And this is relevant often in questions like climate action, for example, which I know you're very interested in. So a lot of people feel powerless, right, when it comes to climate action. They feel what I do has absolutely no impact on what will happen. It's just, government and big companies that have to, take action. And one of the things we're interested in is, to which extent do people understand the social influence they have on others? And if they are made aware of that influence, are they more eager to take, climate action? And so, for example, you might, I've recently, I've told a colleague, that I'm trying to fly less, right? I'm trying to travel to conferences by train and so on. And we spoke about how I do that. And then I met her again, and she's like, "Oh, I'm doing that now too." And and I was like, "Oh, I was very surprised. Wow, she was influenced by what I told her, right?" And obviously, she's talking to other people, and she might influence them. And the question is, to which extent? And obviously, I didn't come up with that idea myself.
But you could have done. I mean, I suppose this is the question: is that one could think about intervention in social networks in a deliberative way, that you're seeking to achieve a particular kind of outcome, such as the more people that feel agency over the climate crisis would be a better thing, because they would be more likely to support change, but also perhaps drive it as well.
Yeah, exactly, because I think a lot of people are on board, that, with the whole idea that we need to do something, against, to combat climate change. And but as we said, a lot of people feel powerless. So if they felt more empowered or felt they had more agency, that would be a good thing. Yeah.
So this form of economic research and analysis is seeking to understand how people live and work within, as it were, kind of real world, and seeking then to think about influences on policy and how policy can be affected. So if you lifted up and were asking questions about policy when it comes to these approaches to economics, What are your thoughts as to where there are points of intervention, what we need to know to make the right decisions, I suppose, which is a big part of economics anyway.
Yes. No, definitely. I mean, obviously, I think it's very important to do sort of evidence-based policies, to understand, what does the data say, what are the mechanisms that are at play before we intervene. Now, it is tempting when we talk about studies like this, to intervene a lot in sort of, in people's belief formation processes, or in trying to make them understand that there is social influence. And there was it was extremely popular, to take behavioral economics insights and trying to sort of nudge people into, changing their behavior in a certain way.
There was the unit within the Cabinet Office in the UK, wasn't there? The behavioral insights.
Yes.
Yep.
And I think, this is a very, important line of thinking. I think it is very important so that it's done openly, that people understand, what you're trying to get them to do. Because I think this idea of, trying to manipulate people by, it can backfire extremely quickly. And I think, we have seen some politicians maybe in the past years in the UK getting carried away with this idea. Oh, I can nudge people to do this or to that by telling them some stories, maybe lies, I don't know, about certain things. And they were very successful with this initially. But then I think very quickly, when people realize that they have not been dealt in an honest way with, they lose trust. And then once you have lost the trust of people, it's very, very difficult to do effective interventions.
Yeah. I mean, trust takes a long time to build and easy to destroy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So kind of deliberative approaches, engaging people in thinking about how things could be changed is a way of kind of going against those sort of more secretive nudge approaches.
I think so, and showing people data actually, and telling them, look, this is, what happens, and this is where this data come from, and helping people also to understand what is good data and bad data, right? I think there is, in the public not a very good understanding of, which data can be trusted, what is a good sample size, right? What is a good method of influence.
Yeah. So when you let the big research on the 10,000 workers in India, you're undertaking the research, and then it's not quite the right word, but there's a kind of translation then required from the detailed research to put it in a form that policymakers, for example, could understand. Is that part of the process as well? It's a kind of self-interpretation of the research and the data to say, these are the implications, this is why you should look at it.
That's right, yeah. No, of course, every time you have data, there is all kinds of ways to analyze these data, right? And one of the things we're moving now, in economics towards is this pre-registration or pre-analysis plans, where you say, before you do your research, how are you planning to analyze this, right? And this limits our, sort of scope in interpreting the data, right? And sort of, changing actually our hypothesis afterwards once we see the data isn't quite. And that helps to improve the quality for sure of research. Now there's a second step, which is sort of translating it for the general public, right? And I think it's something researchers, including myself, are often very sort of hesitant, right, to do, because we obviously are aware of all the detail, all the caveats, right, and we know that one result, even in a very big study like the one we did, right, it could look different in a different context. We know it, and so often we're trying to be cautious, but then it doesn't get the message across, right, and then maybe people who are less cautious and they're getting the message across, but they are not the people who should be getting the message across.
Because may not be more reliable.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think it's an important process, and this is, I guess, part of it. It is serious, so I think it's a very good project. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Friederike Mengel, thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating. For more conversations on how ideas can improve lives and change policy, pop across to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.